Welcome, life science learners, to another installment for today. Today we're focusing on the menstrual cycle and understanding how this occurs. It's important that we recognize where we are today. We've spent some time previously looking at the male and female reproductive systems. Today our focus is on understanding exactly what happens during the menstrual cycle. We will look at events that occur in the ovary as well as in the uterus during this lesson. What is the difference between menstruation and ovulation? I hope that you kind of think through these questions as we get through this presentation. In our lesson today, we're going to focus on the key concepts around menstruation and ovulation. We're going to spend some time looking at the development and the structures within the ovary. I'd spend some time looking at some of the hormones and understand their relationship to the ovary. One of the key concepts, as we discussed, was ovulation. What do we understand by the concept of ovulation? Let's try and unpack the word ovulation. It's got reference to the organ called the ovary, and hence we know that ovulation has got to do with some process that occurs in the ovary. Ovulation is the release of a ripe egg, which we often refer to correctly in scientific term as the ovum, and this is from the ovary. So the release of an egg or an ovum from the ovary is regarded as ovulation. The egg is released when the cavity surrounding breaks open and in response to hormones that are released. When ovulation occurs, we see that the ovum moves into the fallopian tube and becomes available for fertilization. As you would look at my diagram here, a recap on this is the female reproductive system. We can see the ovaries situated in that space there. We also can zoom in on the release of an egg, and this release of an egg from the ovary is referred to as ovulation. And so this egg now travels down the fallopian tube in anticipation of a sperm cell that might approach. And so we say that that process of releasing the egg into the fallopian tube is called ovulation. Let's try and look at the concept of menstruation. Menstruation describes the female period. The menstrual cycle begins when a woman gets her periods. The menstrual blood which leaves her body are products shed from the uterus, which is the inner lining of the uterus called the endometrium. Let's try and understand the context around menstruation. So during the development of the ovary and the ovule or the ovum within the ovary, we see that the endometrial lining of the uterus begins to become vascular or thickened. This process occurs as hormones are released from the ovary. However, at the end of the cycle, the beginning of a new cycle is marked with the release of the endometrium. And this inner lining of the endometrium is shredded away. And that process of releasing the lining of the endometrium is called menstruation. Okay, it's important that we understand the hormones that are associated with these processes. So we're going to discuss these in detail, but it's important that we recognize that the hormone estrogen, progesterone, which are produced from the ovary, play a significant role in both the development of the endometrial lining as well as processes within the ovary. We also need to look at FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and these are released from the pituitary gland and play an important role in regulating the development within the ovary and the uterine lining. Let's look at the structures within the ovary. We're going to look at the primary oocyte, we're going to look at the Graafian follicle, as well as the corpus luteum. This is a diagram that shows a longitudinal section through the ovary. When we look at this in detail, we see a series of events occurring. Right here at the start, we see the primary follicle, which is shown to develop and mature gradually from a primary follicle into what we refer to here as a mature Graafian follicle. We also know that the Graafian follicle around day 14 ruptures and releases an ovum. This process is referred to as ovulation. We also know that after ovulation, that Graafian follicle now forms a structure called the corpus luteum. So, an overview of the primary oocyte. This is the oocyte that arises from the oogonium via the process of oogenesis, so essentially the development of the egg through meiosis, and will give rise to a secondary oocyte and a polar body, which is another small structure that divides from the original oocyte. This occurs at the end of the first meiotic division. Okay, and so that points to the development of this follicle here, which we refer to as the primary follicle. Let's look at the Graafian follicle as I've mentioned. The Graafian follicle is the follicular stage at the end of the first meiotic division, but before ovulation can occur. It therefore contains what we call the haploid oocyte. The corpus luteum, as I mentioned, would be that structure which houses the mature egg, and once that egg has been released from the corpus luteum, from the Graafian follicle, we find that what is left is the corpus luteum. And this is the structure that is essential for the conception to occur and to maintain pregnancy, because it produces an important hormone called progesterone. So guys, we've looked at a cross-section through the ovary, we've looked at the primary follicle, I've pointed out the Graafian follicle, we've also mentioned the process of ovulation occurring here, and we've discussed that Graafian follicle now becomes the corpus luteum, which we see gradually degenerating over the next period of while. Well guys, you've done well. We've looked at some detailed concepts. Let's take a little break, freshen up, and we hope to see you back so that we can do a bit more planning and understanding around these content. Welcome back, life science learners. In this segment, we're going to focus on the uterine and ovarian cycle. Just a recap of what we've looked at. We've looked at the development within the ovary. We've looked at structures such as the primary follicle, the Graafian follicle, as well as the corpus luteum. We're going to try and spend some time now looking at the details of what happens within the ovary. We're also going to look at the uterine cycle and the events that happen within the uterus. So, when we look at the menstrual cycle, we would see that there are 3 phases in the menstrual cycle. And these can be called the follicular phase, which is just before ovulation, and hence it's called the pre-ovulatory phase. We have ovulation, which we've just looked at, as well as we see what happens after ovulation, and we call that the post-ovulatory phase or the luteal phase, and this is with reference to the corpus luteum. When we look at the uterine cycle, this is divided into the following phases. So we refer to the process of menstruation. We also refer to the process of the proliferative stage, as well as the last phase of the secretory or the premenstrual phase. So we're going to try and unpack these by looking at each one in detail. So as I mentioned, when we looked at the ovary, we saw that there were several structures that developed from the primary follicle. We saw that maturing into a Graafian follicle, and we saw the process of ovulation. And then we looked at the development of the corpus luteum and how that gradually degenerates towards the end of the cycle. Let's try and understand this in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned, within the ovary, we see that the primary follicle will develop, and this is developing under the influence of the hormone FSH, which we will talk about in detail as we get into the next segment. The primary follicle gradually develops and it matures into a Graafian follicle. Around day 14, guys, a process of ovulation occurs, and that essentially points to the release of an oocyte. And that oocyte then enters the structure called the fallopian tube, and in anticipation of a sperm cell that may potentially be available for fertilization. We do know that the Graafian follicle now, after releasing an egg, becomes the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum gradually degenerates over the next 14 days, and we know that the corpus luteum plays an important secretory function. Right, so when we look at this, we got to understand that these cyclic changes occur as follows. Firstly, the development of the primary follicle into the mature Graafian follicle takes place between day 1 to day 14. And we see that this process here takes around 14 days. So from the primary follicle all the way to the Graafian follicle, that takes a period of 14 days. At the end of the 14 days, or towards the midpoint of the cycle, the rupturing of the follicle and the release of an immature ovum is called ovulation. And this we see as indicated in the diagram here. We know that after the follicle has been released and the oocyte has left the ovary, that Graafian follicle is now called the corpus luteum. You would see the details of ovulation in this image, where the oocyte is released, and now we refer to that Graafian follicle as the corpus luteum. Again, if we try and unpack the word corpus, so it refers to something that's a dead, and luteum would refer to a degenerating body or structure. And so this corpus luteum then gradually deteriorates over the next 14 odd days. What's important to recognize is that the events in the ovary starts at the birth of a female baby. At birth, there are around 700,000 to 2 million primary oocytes. And these are cells that are in the ovary of the developing fetus. The primary follicles in a baby girl will then undergo further development as the baby matures into a young girl. The primary oocytes remain in a resting phase up until puberty. At puberty, we see that between the ages of 10 to 12 years, the pituitary gland starts to secrete a hormone called FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. This hormone stimulates the development of the primary follicle into what we call the Graafian follicle. So here you see the primary follicle being stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone to develop into the Graafian follicle. What is interesting to note is that only one of these follicles develop to full maturity in every cycle. So in this complete cycle of 28 days, there is a single mature follicle that develops. The mature follicle is known as the Graafian follicle, as I've indicated. The Graafian follicle secretes estrogen as it develops. So this Graafian follicle also releases a hormone called estrogen as it develops. The hormone is responsible for the secondary female characteristics. So in terms of at puberty, the characteristics that we associate with puberty are a result of the hormone called estrogen. And that estrogen is released from the structure called the Graafian follicle, as well as the development of the endometrium. So now we're seeing the association between the ovary and the lining of the uterus. Okay. In our next slide, we can focus on further developments at puberty. The Graafian follicle moves to the surface and the walls of the ovary rupture. When that process occurs, we say that ovulation has taken place, and this is usually around day 14. Okay, and this is based on the day when menstruation has started. So when a female starts her menstrual flow, that is regarded as day 1. So the 14th day after that would be seen as the day when ovulation is most likely to occur. The process of ovulation is stimulated by a hormone called LH. So the pituitary gland releases a hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH, and that targets the mature follicle, which is secreted so that the follicle ruptures and releases an egg. At puberty, we see that after ovulation, the Graafian follicle then develops under the influence of the hormone LH, and it now becomes a mass of cells known as the corpus luteum, as I've indicated here. So after the process of ovulation, the Graafian follicle forms the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum has a significantly important function, as it secretes a hormone called progesterone. And the progesterone plays an important role in maintaining the lining of the endometrium in anticipation of implantation of a sperm. And we will look at that in our next slide. If the released secondary oocyte is not fertilized, then we'll see that the corpus luteum degenerates. So in this image, we can see that there's degeneration of the corpus luteum, and that degenerated follicle is an indication that fertilization has not taken place. However, if fertilization does occur, we will see that the corpus luteum continues its function until the end of the 12th week. So we would see that the corpus luteum maintains its structure for the next 12 weeks, because the corpus luteum is responsible for the production of progesterone, and that will maintain the lining of the endometrium. So when we look at the overview of this, so we've spent some time looking at the development within the ovary. As I mentioned, we started with the process of ovulation. We see that during ovulation, the egg or the oocyte was released, and we refer to that as the ovulatory phase. We now see that during the luteal phase, which is when the corpus luteum remains intact, it will release a hormone called progesterone, and that progesterone helps to thicken the endometrial lining. And here we clearly see the thickening of the endometrium. And we mentioned that if that corpus luteum is not fertilized, it will lead to a process where the lining is released, and we refer to that as the menstrual phase, where the lining of the endometrium is released. And that occurs due to the corpus luteum degenerating and a decrease in the level of progesterone. So the reason why the menstrual phase occurs is because fertilization has not occurred, and that means that the level of progesterone decreases. When that level of progesterone decreases, it results in the lining of the endometrium being released. And so we refer to that as menstruation, as you would see here. If we look at the next phase, the follicular phase, this again goes back to the development of a new follicle within the ovary. Now, let's look at the process of the uterine cycle. So we've mentioned that the endometrium of the uterus is rich in glands and blood vessels. So we say that it is highly vascular because it contains lots of blood vessels, and rich in glands that produce secretions. So from puberty to menopause, that's a period in the female reproductive system, their lifespan where they stop producing eggs. We find that the endometrium undergoes a monthly cyclic change, and this is known as the uterine cycle. So the events that occur on a cyclic basis in the uterus are referred to the uterine cycle. After ovulation, the uterus must be ready for implantation and the nutrition of a fertilized ovum. So let's try and understand that. So the female hormones, which are known as estrogen and progesterone, are responsible for thickening of the endometrium. So when we looked at the structure of the ovary, we saw that the primary follicle develops and releases and is released. This structure, called the corpus luteum, the Graafian follicle, stimulates the release of estrogen. So the Graafian follicle releases estrogen, and the estrogen is responsible for preparing the lining of the endometrium. Let's understand what happens. If fertilization does not occur, we know that the thickened and the vascularized tissue from the endometrium is not needed for implantation, simply because there is no egg ready for implantation. What happens then is that the upper layers of the endometrium membrane break down and are released with the unfertilized egg, or sometimes the immature egg, and leaves the body via the cervix and the vagina. This process is called menstruation. So as you would see here in this image, we see the process of menstruation occurring, and that's because the egg has reached the uterine chamber where no fertilization has taken place. The corpus luteum within the ovaries degenerate, and the level of progesterone decreases. And when the levels of progesterone decrease, you find that the lining of the vascular membrane in the endometrium releases and it's discharged out of the body. And that process is called menstruation. Menstruation can last between 4 to 6 days. And this is essentially immediately after the progesterone levels decrease. So the endometrium in the uterus immediately starts to thicken once to prepare for the arrival of the next fertilized ovum. So we find that the next cycle begins. Some females may experience pain during menstruation, while others have little to no side effects or discomfort. So you would see that towards the end of the menstrual cycle, we find that a new cycle referring to the events in the ovary occur. So the follicular phase, where, as we discussed earlier on, we find that the primary follicle then develops, and we get on to the next cycle where after 14 days we find ovulation taking place. We then look at the next cycle of events, which is at the end of that next 28 days cycle, we find the beginning of menstruation, which marks the beginning of a new follicular phase. Well guys, you've done well. We've looked at some detailed concepts. Let's take a little break, freshen up, and we hope to see you back so that we can do a bit more planning and understanding around these content. Welcome back, life science learners. Trust that you're feeling refreshed, energized. Let's continue with our lesson and let's get straight into the next part. So the focus is on the hormonal control. We're going to spend some time looking at the different hormones. We're going to understand the concepts of how these hormones coordinate the functions in the body and around the uterus and the events that occur in the ovary. And we're going to link the concept of negative feedback to this process. Have you ever thought about the following? How are the ovary and the uterus able to coordinate their function so that the uterus is ready for implantation of a fertilized egg? An interesting question. I hope that as we get through this lesson, you're able to answer this question. It's very important that we try and understand what are the hormones associated with the menstrual cycle. In our previous lessons, we've looked at the two hormones that are released from the ovary, and those were estrogen as well as progesterone. We also know that the pituitary gland, or the hypophysis, releases two important hormones, and these were FSH and LH. Let's try and understand the roles of these hormones and how they bring about and coordinate the events that occur in both the ovary and the uterus. So let's look at estrogen. It is produced by the ovaries in most female animals. The estrogen controls the reproductive cycle and prepares the body for pregnancy. Progesterone, on the other hand, is a hormone released by the ovaries. It is also necessary for the implantation of the fertilized egg in the uterus and for maintaining pregnancy. So guys, estrogen predominantly is responsible for the changes that occur at puberty. So we see that estrogen prepares the body for what we call the development of the female and her ability to be able to produce an egg. We see that the ovary also is responsible for the production of progesterone. Progesterone plays an important role in maintaining the lining of the endometrium as well as pregnancy. The other two hormones that we mentioned are FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. And so think about what a follicle is. We're going to look at a diagram in a bit that refers to the primary follicle. And so FSH stimulates and helps to control the menstrual cycle and the growth of the egg in the ovary. The FSH levels in the woman change throughout the menstrual cycle, with the highest level happening just before the egg is released, and we call that just before ovulation. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, is released from the pituitary gland, and this helps to control the menstrual cycle. It also triggers the release of an egg from the ovary. So LH triggers the process of ovulation, and so we would expect that around day 14, the level of LH to be the highest. So around the 14th day, you would expect there to be an increase in the level of LH, and that is linked to the process of ovulation. LH levels quickly rise just before ovulation, and that would be an indication of the process of ovulation. Let's try and link the menstrual cycle and the events in the ovarian cycle. So in this image, I've illustrated the lining of the endometrium, and in this bottom half of the image, I've indicated the events that occur within the endometrium. Let's try and understand what happens during the build-up of the endometrium. So we call that the premenstrual cycle, and this is when the lining of the endometrium is prepared for implantation. We know that the ovary releases a hormone called estrogen, and that estrogen helps to thicken the lining of the endometrium. During the menstrual phase, we know that this is the phase when the level of progesterone radically decreases, and we say that the lining of the endometrium is now shredded away. This is then followed by a postmenstrual cycle, which is when the lining of the endometrium becomes vascularized, and so we see the level of estrogen, which is again increased by the ovary. Okay, let's try and understand this again. So we looked at how the ovary releases the hormones that helps to thicken the lining of the ovary. What is menstruation? It's the breakdown of the endometrium and the release from the body. And you would see that that clearly occurs here, and that again is due to a decrease in the level of progesterone. Guys, in this segment, we focused on the hormones. We're going to go into a little break, and we're going to look at the negative feedback mechanism and how these hormones bring about coordinated function between the various structures and the developments within the uterine lining. Have a little break, freshen up, and we'll see you in a little while. Welcome back, Life Science learners, to the next segment of today's lesson. We've just focused on the hormones. We've looked at what they play, their roles. Now we're going to try and understand the negative feedback mechanism behind these. Essentially, how do these hormones coordinate their function? Let's understand the concept of negative feedback as an overview before we get into understanding how these hormones interact with each other. An important concept that we need to look at is homeostasis. They will be significantly explained better in a section later on when we do the endocrine system. But it's important that we understand what homeostasis is at the moment. Homeostasis is the tendency to resist change and to maintain a stable, relatively constant internal environment. I often refer to it as simply as a process of maintaining a constant internal environment. Let's try and understand the importance of this. We know that the hormones tend to fluctuate. They tend to increase and decrease at various stages during the reproductive cycle. How does this balance maintain? It's through a process called negative feedback. And so we see the relationship between hormones where some hormones increase, causing a decrease in the other, and likewise an increase in another hormone causing a decrease in one hormone. So that concept can be illustrated using this illustration here. So we know that there are stimulation that can cause a certain receptor to increase the release of a hormone, and we see that that hormone has an effect, and that effect brings about a balance. And we know that this balance that we require is important for the optimal functioning of an organism. So when we look at the concept of homeostasis, we need to look at the concepts around the negative feedback and the positive feedback mechanisms. Let's try and understand what negative feedback and positive feedback actually try and establish in an organism. So when we look at negative feedback, we see that it brings about conditions back to normal whenever they start to become too extreme or higher than normal. We also know that the positive feedback will cause a condition to return back to normal, especially when there's an increase in extremity. So the mechanism around homeostasis is essentially the two mechanisms either responding to an increase or responding to a decrease. And the idea is to be able to bring that balance back in the body, and that balance is homeostasis. So in order for us to understand the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle, it is important that we graphically illustrate this process. So the graph shows the relationship between the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, as well as the interaction of the hormones in each cycle. Let us pause and reflect at the graph. When you look at this graph, on the x-axis we have time plotted in days from day 0 to day 28, and essentially this is the first day when menstruation starts. We also see that this graph illustrates the thickness of the endometrium. It shows you the different ovarian hormones, which are estrogen as well as progesterone. We also see the release of the hormones from the pituitary gland, which are LH and FSH, and we look at the relationship of that to the development within the ovary and the formation of the follicle. So when we look at this, we get a broad sense of the various different interactions between the hormones in the ovary as well as the hormones from the pituitary gland. Now I'm going to pause at this point and reflect specifically on what happens between days 1 to 14. Now guys, the pituitary gland secretes FSH, which again stimulates the development of the primary follicle into the mature grafton follicle. When we look at this graph, let's try and identify FSH. So we see that at the start of the cycle, the FSH levels decrease, and as they increase, you find that the development of the follicle up here tends to increase in size. So as we mentioned, the follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of the primary follicle. And as that primary follicle develops, we see the level of estrogen increasing. And that's the relationship between the estrogen being produced by this developing follicle. I'm going to pause at that, and we're going to need to reflect on the next concept. So as I mentioned, when we look at the pituitary hormone, and in this case follicle stimulating hormone, we see that the levels of follicle stimulating hormone gradually increase between day 1 to day 14. This in turn causes the development of the primary follicle into what we call a mature Graafian follicle. As that occurs, we see that estrogen levels increase, and we can see the link between estrogen levels increasing and next the thickness of the endometrium. So guys, if we were to explain that, so the pituitary gland releases FSH. The follicle stimulating hormone targets the primary follicle. That follicle gradually develops, and as it develops, it releases a hormone called estrogen. As estrogen is released, we find that the lining of the endometrium begins to thicken or become more vascular. So these are the events that occur from day 1 to day 14. Right, so the developing follicle secretes more estrogen, and this estrogen stimulates the development of the endometrium tissue, resulting in it becoming thickened or more vascular. Estrogen, on the other hand, inhibits the release of FSH so that only one follicle can mature at a time. So what we notice is that as the estrogen levels increase, we see that there is a decrease in the levels of FSH. And this is a mechanism to ensure that a single follicle develops. So the development of this follicle causes an increase in estrogen, and that in turn suppresses or has a negative impact, suppressing the level of FSH so that a single egg develops. Okay, and we clearly see that in this image here, as I mentioned, that estrogen increases and we see that FSH decreases. Let's try and understand what happens with the increase in estrogen just before day 14. We find that around day 14, LH stimulates the process of ovulation, and this means that an egg is released. Under the influence of LH, the follicle ruptures and it then transforms into what we call the corpus luteum. Let's try and look at that in this image here. So around day 14, guys, which is probably around the midpoint of the 28-day cycle, we see that the level of LH tends to increase. When LH increases, it is linked to the rupturing or the release of an egg or an oocyte from the mature follicle. So we refer to that process as ovulation. So what is the hormone that stimulates ovulation? LH. When does this peak? We see the peak in LH close to day 14. So as soon as we get to day 13, we see a radical increase in the LH levels, which then causes the rupturing of the follicle. And when that follicle ruptures, it releases, we refer to that process now having an effect on the estrogen level. So we see now that when LH peaks, we see the process of progesterone, the level of progesterone beginning to increase. We now look at the events after day 14. We see that the endometrium begins to thicken considerably in preparation for the implantation of the fertilized egg. And this is due to the effect of estrogen and, more importantly, progesterone. Now I'm going to go to the slide and revisit this. So we see now the relationship after day 14, we see there's an increase in the progesterone levels. We know that progesterone has a significant impact on preparing the lining for pregnancy. The lining of the endometrium is now thickened and is maintained for the next 14 days. This is all due to the release of progesterone from the structure called the corpus luteum. Let's try and understand what maintains the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is maintained by the luteinizing hormone. So after day 14, the corpus luteum is maintained by LH, and in turn, the corpus luteum stimulates the production of progesterone, and we see that the progesterone now thickens and maintains the lining of the endometrium. After day 14, we see that corpus luteum has released progesterone, and as you mentioned, progesterone plays an important role in thickening the endometrial lining. Progesterone in turn inhibits the release of FSH, and we will look at that in the graph, so that only a single follicle matures at the time. Progesterone also inhibits the secretion of LH and thus prevents further ovulation. The production of progesterone and estrogen will stop, which then further leads to the following. So as we know, the function of progesterone is to maintain the lining of the endometrium. A decrease in that will have an effect on the maintenance of the endometrial lining, and this, we say, will cause the process of menstruation. The secretion of FSH is no longer inhibited, which means that FSH is then released to stimulate the development of a new follicle. And this entire cycle starts over again. So before I continue with that, let me just go back to this slide. And it's important that we look at what happens at the start of a new cycle. And so we know that menstruation is the beginning of a new cycle. What is important to understand is that the lining of the endometrium tends to shed away because of a decrease in the level of progesterone. Let's try and understand what is the function of progesterone. Progesterone maintains the lining of the endometrium as well as maintains the process of pregnancy. So when we see that there is a decrease in the level of progesterone, it would mean that the lining has to now be released. And that happens predominantly because the corpus luteum has now degenerated and does not stimulate the production of progesterone. We notice that when the progesterone levels decrease, we also know that FSH levels will increase, and this will stimulate the formation of a new follicle. And we see that this cycle continues to occur. So guys, let's try and understand the relationship between these hormones. So in this image, we're discussing the negative feedback process in the reproductive hormones. And let's try and look at all of the information together in one illustration. So the pituitary gland produces two hormones. It produces firstly FSH, and we see these solid lines indicating the stimulation of a hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone targets the development of a primary follicle into what we refer to as a mature Graafian follicle. As that follicle develops, we know that it stimulates the release of estrogen. When estrogen levels peak, it inhibits or stops the level of FSH. We know that estrogen now acts on the endometrium, causing the lining of the endometrium to thicken. However, we also need to recognize that around day 14, the luteinizing hormone levels increase, and when luteinizing hormone level increases, we see that it begins to target the corpus luteum. When it targets the corpus luteum, it will cause a process of ovulation. This in turn will mean that the corpus luteum then releases progesterone. As the levels of progesterone increase, it will then inhibit the secretion of FSH, which will stop the production of a new egg. And we refer to that as the negative feedback. So the negative feedback of progesterone stops FSH levels and hence stops the production of a new egg. However, we know that if fertilization does not take place, we will find that the level of progesterone decreases because the corpus luteum has degenerated. When that level decreases, we see the levels of FSH then increasing, and we see FSH now starting to act on a new follicle. And so this process continues to occur on a cyclic basis. So guys, we've looked at the function of these hormones. We've looked at the concept of how negative feedback occurs. It's important that we recognize that FSH stimulates the primary follicle developing. When the primary follicle develops, it develops and matures into a Graafian follicle. During that process, estrogen is released, and that estrogen goes into the uterine lining, thickening the uterus. As we mentioned, around day 14, LH levels peak, and when LH levels peak, FSH levels would have decreased. LH then causes the rupturing of a follicle, and we refer to that process as ovulation. What is left now is the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum will then stimulate the ovary to produce progesterone. Progesterone levels then increase and then thicken the endometrial lining, and this is what maintains the thickness of the endometrium. Should a female fall pregnant, the corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone, maintaining the lining of the endometrium. However, if there is no sperm present and no fertilization, we see that the corpus luteum degenerates, causing a decrease in progesterone, and this in turn will cause the lining of the endometrium to be shredded, and refer to that as menstruation. And this starts the process all over again with a new cycle, starting with FSH levels increasing. So guys, it's been a lesson where we've looked at the function of these hormones and how they maintain the process of ovulation, menstruation, as well as the changes that occur both in the endometrium as well as in the ovary. You guys have done well. You've paid attention. Wish you well. Take care. Be safe.